Hi everyone. In this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between Vishwanathan Anand and Garry Kasparov. This was played in the 1995 PCA World Championship in New York. And without further ado, let's look at this game. Anand starts by playing the move e4, and we have c5 by Kasparov, so the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and after a couple of more moves, we reach a position that signals that Anand wants to go for the Yugoslav attack. Knight c6 by Kasparov, just developing his knight, bishop c4, bishop d7, and now we have queenside castle by Anand. And here, Kasparov plays knight e5. And if you ever played the Sicilian or you know how it works, then you know that Black's intention with this knight e5 or knight a5 move is to transfer this rook over to c8. He's trying to play this knight to c4 move, and essentially he's going to win the bishop pair, either by capturing the e3 bishop or by forcing the b3 bishop to capture the knight, and then the rook will capture on c4. And that's usually the plan that Black would want to get in the Sicilian. So Anand does that. He plays bishop b3, we have rook c8, h4, h5, and now king to b1. Kasparov now plays knight c4, and Anand does capture, and he retreats his knight to e2. And here, Kasparov plays the move b5. And the move b5 is obviously trying to get an attack started on the queen side. And usually, if you've ever studied the Sicilian defense and even games that have occurred in the Sicilian defense, you'll know that Black usually has intentions of playing an exchange sacrifice on the c3 square. So one purpose of this knight de2 move is just to reinforce the knight on c3, just in case. So we have b5 by Kasparov and bishop h6. Anand is trying to get his own attack on the king side. Queen a5 was played by Kasparov, and now an exchange of bishops and knight f4. So after rook fc8, we have knight cd5 and a change of queens, knight d5, and king f8, defending the e7 pawn. And here Anand plays rook e1, kind of abandoning the h4 pawn, but getting ready for pawn thrusts such as e5 and trying to open the position up more. We have rook to b8 and b3, attacking the rook. Rook c5 and knight f4. Rook from b comes back to c8 and king to b2. a5 and a3. And we can see that even though Kasparov does not actually have a queen on the board, he's very successful in getting his attack going. King to g7, just a prophylactic move, and now knight to d5. And what this knight d5 move is trying to do is obviously attack e7, but also it's trying to play this knight b6 move. And of course, if Kasparov allows this, where he would actually have to exchange the pieces off the board, then this wouldn't exactly be the best for him. I mean, yes, his rooks are centralized on the c-file, but once this knight is exchanged for this bishop on d7, this allows Anand to play moves like e5, and in the future, maybe even e6, and that could damage the structure of Kasparov's pawns quite severely. So we have bishop e6, avoiding the fork on b6, and b4. So a b4, rook c4, and here a very big mistake was played by Anand. In this position, you should have actually just played the move c3. And what c3 does is that after the move bishop takes d5, removing the guard of the c3 pawn, white can just play either e takes d5 or rook takes d5. And after rook d5, rook c3, rook e2, there isn't exactly any way that Kasparov can actually break through with both of his rooks. Even though he does have rooks barreling down toward the c-file, it doesn't seem to really work, because after rook c4, attacking the b4 pawn, Anand can just capture on b5, and all of a sudden his threat of playing g3, e5, and weakening Kasparov's pawn structure is going to be a very big threat from Anand's side. So it's best to maybe play c3, and even if you're going to lose a pawn temporarily, it's worth it because maybe you could create a passed pawn on your own, and there isn't really that much danger towards it. However, Anand played the very big mistake move. He played knight b6. And what Anand actually thought was going to happen was that Kasparov, after he captures the pawn on b4 with check, Anand will just play the move king a3. And essentially, Kasparov must give up the exchange. He could either try playing rook a4 check to give up the exchange, or rook c4. And after this was played, you could capture either rook, preferably this one, and maybe after something like bishop c8. Even though Kasparov has an extra pawn for the exchange, this is not going to be enough compensation for him, and after rook e3, bishop e6, maybe after king b2, there's a way for Anand to somehow trade the rooks off, and he would get a better position for himself. However, that is completely the opposite of what Kasparov actually did. After king a3, it does seem like Kasparov is completely lost, but the next move he played completely changed the way you look at the position. So I encourage you to pause the video and find out what Kasparov played that essentially wins the game on the spot. Okay, so what Kasparov played was actually rook takes c2, and this is quite a very nice idea. Point being that if you capture this rook on b4, then Kasparov will just capture the rook on d2, and he's winning. Of course, there is a threat on this g2 pawn. Kasparov is also just up 2 pawns in general, so it's going to be a lot easier for him to convert. For instance, if you move this pawn to g3, then after rook d3, it's very hard to defend this pawn. You could try rook to f1, but after rook b3 check, king a5, and now b4, the advancement of this pawn is really going to drive white nuts, and it's going to be really hard for white to do anything about it. Now, obviously, you don't have to capture the rook on b4. You could also just capture the rook on c2. But here was the true intention of Kasparov's move. After rook takes c2, Kasparov will play rook b3 check. And the entire idea of rook takes c2 was actually to remove the c2 pawn, so that you can deliver this check. And also, after the king goes to a2, Kasparov can just play the move rook e3 check. And essentially after this, Kasparov is going to win the e1 rook. He's going to have a 2-pawn advantage, and I don't see how Anand can do anything about it. Let's say rook c7. Anand could just try rook e2 check. And if you don't want to lose this g2 pawn, then rook c2 must be played. But after a trade on c2 and follow up with f5, we can most certainly guarantee that Anand is not going to win this game. So that is why after the move rook takes c2 was played, Anand resigned the game, and a very brilliant victory for Garry Kasparov. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.